She mopped the floors in silence, invisible to the young recruits who strutted past her like she was nothing more than part of the furniture. They laughed at her accent, mocked her worn-out shoes, and treated her like she was beneath them. But when they shoved her down those concrete stairs, leaving her crumpled at the bottom, they had no idea who she really was. The SEAL commander's face went white when he saw her lying there, because the woman they'd just assaulted wasn't just a cleaning lady. She was someone who had survived things that would break most of these recruits before breakfast. This is the story of Irene Hill, and how one moment of cruelty exposed a truth that would change everything. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Naval Special Warfare Training Center Coronado, casting long shadows across the polished hallway floors. Irene Hill pushed her cleaning cart slowly, methodically, the wheels squeaking with each rotation as she made her way toward the East Wing barracks. She was 32 years old, though the lines around her eyes made her look older, etched there by experiences that had nothing to do with the passage of time. Her hands, small and calloused, gripped the mop handle with practiced efficiency. She'd been working at the base for 6 months now, arriving before dawn and leaving after sunset, moving through the facility like a ghost. The recruits barely noticed her. To them, she was just the cleaning lady, the quiet European woman with the thick accent who emptied their trash and scrubbed their toilets. Irene didn't mind being invisible. In fact, she preferred it. Invisibility had kept her alive once before in a different life, in a different country. Here in California, at this prestigious naval facility, she found a strange comfort in the mundane repetition of her work. Mop the floors, wipe the windows, clean the bathrooms, simple tasks that required no explanation, no questions, no memories. The sound of boots thundering down the hallway broke through her quiet rhythm. A group of recruits rounded the corner, their voices loud and boisterous, still riding the high of completing their morning physical training. They were young, most of them barely 21, fresh from civilian life and drunk on the idea of becoming elite warriors. Irene stepped aside, pressing her cart against the wall to let them pass. She kept her eyes down, a habit formed long ago when drawing attention meant danger. But keeping her head down didn't make her invisible to these young men. It made her a target. "Excuse me, ma'am," one of them said, his tone dripping with mock politeness as he brushed past her cart, deliberately knocking her bucket so that dirty water sloshed onto the floor she'd just cleaned. The others laughed. Irene said nothing, just reached for her mop to clean up the spill. She'd learned that silence was often the best response to cruelty. Engaging only encouraged them. "Hey, doesn't she speak English?" another recruit asked, loud enough for Irene to hear. "Maybe she's illegal. Should we report her?" "Nah, man," a third voice chimed in. "They need someone to clean up after us. Might as well be her." Irene's jaw tightened, but she continued mopping, her movements steady and controlled. She'd heard worse, much worse. These boys, with their brand new uniforms and untested confidence, had no idea what real cruelty looked like. They played at being warriors, while she scrubbed the evidence of their privileged lives from bathroom tiles. The training center was buzzing with activity as the morning progressed. Officers moved with purpose through the corridors, instructors barked orders in the distance, and the recruits prepared for another day of grueling training, designed to separate the capable from the inadequate. Irene moved through it all, waxing a current beneath the surface, present but unacknowledged. She worked her way up to the third floor, where the senior recruit quarters were located. This was where the men who'd made it past the initial screening lived, the ones who thought they'd already proven themselves. Their arrogance filled the hallways like a thick fog, and Irene had learned to navigate around it carefully. As she cleaned the common area, she overheard conversations that revealed more than the speakers intended. These young recruits talked freely around her, as if her presence didn't register as human enough to warrant discretion. They discussed their training, their fears, their dreams of becoming SEALs. Some of it made Irene smile quietly to herself. They had no idea what they were getting into. One recruit, a tall kid with sandy blonde hair and a perpetual smirk, seemed particularly fond of making Irene's job harder. His name was Tyler, and he'd appointed himself the unofficial leader of his cohort. He left messes deliberately, dropped trash just after she'd cleaned an area, and made comments about her appearance whenever she was within earshot. "Think she understands what we're saying?" Tyler asked his friends one afternoon, as Irene cleaned the windows nearby. "Does it matter?" Another responded. "She's just here to clean." "Yeah, but it's funny to watch her pretend she doesn't hear us," Tyler continued. "Look at her, just scrubbing away like a little robot." Irene's hand paused on the window for just a fraction of a second before continuing its circular motion. She'd developed an impressive ability to compartmentalize, to separate her emotional reactions from her physical actions. It was a skill she'd honed years ago, when survival depended on not showing fear, not showing anger, not showing anything at all. The afternoon wore on, and Irene made her way to the stairwell, connecting the third and second floors. It was a utilitarian space, all concrete and metal railings with harsh fluorescent lighting that buzzed constantly. She was cleaning the landing when she heard footsteps approaching from above. Tyler and 3 of his friends appeared at the top of the stairs, their training session apparently over for the day. They were loud, aggressive, their bodies pumped full of adrenaline from whatever exercise they'd just completed. Irene positioned her cart closer to the wall, making room for them to pass. But Tyler had other plans. Well, if it isn't our favorite janitor," Tyler announced, his voice echoing in the concrete stairwell. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making his smirk look almost sinister. Irene kept her eyes on her work, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the landing. Her heart rate remained steady, controlled. She'd been in worse situations than being trapped in a stairwell with arrogant young men. Much worse. "You know what I don't understand," Tyler continued, descending a few steps until he was level with the landing where Irene worked. His friends followed, forming a semicircle that effectively blocked her exit. "I don't understand why they hire people who can't even speak proper English. Like, how are you supposed to understand instructions if you can barely communicate?" "Maybe she communicates just fine," one of his friends, a stocky recruit named Derek, suggested. "Maybe she just doesn't want to talk to you, Tyler." The group laughed, but there was an edge to it, a collective cruelty that came from pack mentality. These weren't bad kids, not really, but together, feeding off each other's energy, they became something meaner, something that needed to prove its dominance. "Is that it?" Tyler asked, leaning against the railing and staring at Irene. "You just don't want to talk to us? Think you're too good for a conversation?" Irene straightened up slowly, her mop held loosely in her hands. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, her European accent making each word precise. "I am here to work. Please, let me pass." "Oh, she does speak," Tyler exclaimed with exaggerated surprise. "And here I thought you were mute. What are you anyway? Polish, Russian, one of those Eastern European countries we can't pronounce?" "Croatian," Irene said simply, reaching for her cart to move it past them. But Tyler stepped in front of her cart, blocking her path. "Croatian, huh? So what's a Croatian lady doing? Cleaning toilets at a US naval facility? Couldn't find work back home?" Irene's hands tightened on the cart handle, but her face remained expressionless. This was a game she'd played before, in different contexts, with different players. The key was not to react, not to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten under her skin. "I need to finish my work," she said, her voice still calm. "Please move." "Please move," Tyler mimicked in an exaggerated accent, causing his friends to snicker. "You know what? I'm getting real tired of this attitude. We're training to become Navy SEALs, the best of the best, and we have to step around cleaning ladies who act like they own the place." "Tyler, come on, man," Derek said, though his tone lacked any real conviction. "Let's just go. We've got that briefing in 20 minutes. But Tyler was on a roll now, his ego inflated by the attention of his peers. He'd been having a rough week in training, had been called out by instructors for sloppy technique, and his pride needed somewhere to land. Irene, quiet and defenseless, made an easy target. "You know what I think," Tyler said, pushing her cart slightly so it rolled back toward her. "I think you need to learn some respect. we're going to be out there risking our lives. And people like you get to hide behind mops and buckets, contributing nothing. Irene's eyes, which had been carefully neutral, flickered with something that might have been anger or might have been pain. For just a moment, her carefully constructed walls showed a crack. "You know nothing about contribution," she said quietly. "Nothing about sacrifice." The words were soft, but they carried a weight that made Tyler pause. For a second, something passed across his face. Uncertainty, maybe, or the first hint of recognition that he'd crossed a line. But his friends were watching, and backing down now would mean losing face. "Oh, so now you're going to lecture me?" Tyler's voice rose, his face flushing. "You're going to tell me about sacrifice? You clean floors for a living?" He reached out and shoved her cart hard, sending it rolling backward. Irene stumbled slightly, trying to keep her balance. The cart hit the wall with a loud clang that echoed through the stairwell. "Tyler, that's enough," Derek said, more firmly this time. "Let's go." But something had shifted in Tyler's demeanor. The adrenaline from training, the frustration from his week, the need to assert dominance, it all coalesced into a moment of terrible judgment. As Irene moved to retrieve her cart, Tyler stepped forward and gave her a sharp push. It wasn't meant to be hard. Tyler would later claim he was just trying to move her out of the way, that he barely touched her. But Irene was small, and she was standing at the top of the concrete stairs, and physics doesn't care about intentions. She stumbled backward, her arms windmilling as she tried to catch her balance. Time seemed to slow down. Derek's eyes widened in horror. Another recruit reached out, but was too far away. Tyler's smirk vanished, replaced by sudden fear as he realized what he'd done. Irene fell. Her body hit the concrete stairs with sickening thuds, each impact echoing through the stairwell like gunshots. She tumbled down 12 steps before her body came to rest on the landing below, twisted and motionless. The stairwell erupted into chaos. Tyler stood frozen at the top, his face drained of all color. Derek rushed down the stairs, shouting for help. The other recruits scattered, some running for assistance, others standing paralyzed by shock. Irene lay at the bottom of the stairs, her cleaning uniform torn, blood seeping from a cut on her forehead. Her eyes were closed, and for a terrible moment, the recruits thought they might have killed her. "Get a medic!" Derek screamed into the hallway. "Someone get a medic now!" Footsteps thundered from multiple directions. Within seconds, the stairwell filled with people. Instructors appeared, their training kicking in as they assessed the situation. Someone was calling for an ambulance. Others were securing the scene, asking what happened, demanding answers. And then, cutting through the chaos like a knife, came a voice that made everyone freeze. "What the hell happened here?" Commander James Hartley stood at the top of the stairs, his presence commanding immediate silence. He was a legend at the training center, a former SEAL Team 6 operator with 23 years of service and more decorations than most people could count. When he spoke, everyone listened. His eyes scanned the scene. The cleaning cart overturned at the top of the stairs, the supplies scattered across the landing, the recruits standing in various states of shock, and Irene lying motionless at the bottom. When his gaze landed on Irene, something changed in Commander Hartley's expression. The professional mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, replaced by something that looked like recognition, then horror, then rage. He descended the stairs 2 at a time, pushing past the gathering crowd. When he reached Irene, he dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her body as if afraid to touch her, afraid to confirm what he already knew. "Irene?" His voice cracked on her name. "Irene, can you hear me?" The medics arrived, pushing through the crowd with their equipment, but Commander Hartley didn't move, didn't step aside. He stayed kneeling next to her, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. "Sir," one of the medics said carefully, "we need to examine her." Commander Hartley finally stood, but he didn't move far. His eyes swept over the assembled recruits, landing on Tyler, whose guilt was written across his face in bold letters. "Who," Commander Hartley's voice was low, dangerous, "is responsible for this? We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated." Now, let's return to the narrative. The silence in the stairwell was suffocating. Tyler stood at the top of the stairs, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Around him, his fellow recruits had taken several steps back, creating a physical distance that mirrored their desperate desire to separate themselves from what had just happened. Commander Hartley's question hung in the air like a blade. "I'll ask one more time. Who is responsible for this?" Derek, still standing near Irene's motionless form, looked up at Tyler with an expression that mixed pity and disgust. "It was Tyler, sir. Recruit Tyler Bennett. He pushed her." "I didn't mean to." Tyler's voice cracked as he finally found his words. She was in the way, and I barely touched her. I swear, sir, I barely touched her." Commander Hartley's eyes narrowed. He took a step toward the stairs, his body coiled with barely contained fury. "You barely touched her," he repeated, his voice deadly calm. "And now she's lying unconscious at the bottom of a concrete stairwell with a head injury. Tell me, Recruit Bennett, in your extensive training, does that qualify as barely touching someone?" Tyler opened his mouth, but no words came out. The reality of what he'd done was finally crashing down on him, and the weight of it was more than his ego could support. The medics worked quickly, stabilizing Irene's neck with a cervical collar and checking her vital signs. One of them looked up at Commander Hartley with a reassuring nod. "Pulse is strong, sir. She's breathing normally. Looks like a concussion and possibly some bruised ribs, but we won't know the full extent until we get her to medical." "Transport her immediately," Hartley ordered. "I want her in the best facility we have access to. Call Balboa Naval Medical Center and tell them I'm sending someone. I want their trauma team ready." "Sir," the medic hesitated. "For a civilian contractor, the protocol is usually—" "I don't care about protocol." Hartley's voice thundered through the stairwell, making several recruits flinch. "You will transport her to Balboa, and you will ensure she receives the best possible care. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." As the medics carefully loaded Irene onto a stretcher, her eyes fluttered open briefly. She looked disoriented, confused, her gaze unfocused. When her eyes found Commander Hartley's face, something like recognition passed through them, followed by what might have been embarrassment or shame. "James," she whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. The use of his first name shocked the nearby recruits who'd never heard anyone address the commander with such familiarity. "Don't talk," Hartley said gently, a stark contrast to the rage he'd displayed moments earlier. "Just rest. You're going to be fine." Irene's eyes closed again as the medics carried her away. The sound of the stretcher wheels echoed through the hallway, and then she was gone, leaving behind only the overturned cleaning cart and a stairwell full of stunned military personnel. Commander Hartley stood motionless for a long moment, his back to the assembled recruits. When he finally turned around, his expression was carved from stone. "Recruit Bennett, you are confined to quarters pending a full investigation. Master Chief Williams, escort him and post a guard. I want a complete statement from everyone who witnessed this incident on my desk within the hour." "Sir, I really didn't mean—" Tyler began. "You are not to speak unless directly questioned," Hartley cut him off. "You have caused grievous harm to someone under the protection of this facility. The fact that you didn't mean to is irrelevant. Actions have consequences, and you are about to learn that lesson in the harshest way possible." As Tyler was led away, the remaining recruits shifted uncomfortably. They'd all witnessed the incident. Some had even laughed when Tyler first started hassling Irene. Now, they were accomplices to something that suddenly felt much bigger than a simple case of bullying. Commander Hartley's eyes swept over them, and each recruit felt the weight of his judgment. "The rest of you will wait in the briefing room. No one leaves. No one talks to anyone outside this group. You're all potential witnesses to an assault, and until I understand exactly what happened here, you're all under scrutiny." The recruits filed out silently, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Commander Hartley remained in the stairwell, staring at the spot where Irene had fallen. His hands were shaking, though whether from rage or fear or something else entirely, no one could tell. The briefing room felt more like a holding cell than a meeting space. 20 recruits sat in rigid silence, each consumed by their own thoughts about what they'd witnessed and what it might mean for their futures. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, marking time with their constant buzzing. Derek sat, apart from the others, his head in his hands. He'd tried to stop Tyler, hadn't he? He'd said that's enough, had told him to let it go, but he hadn't done more than that. He hadn't physically intervened, hadn't put himself between Tyler and Irene. Did that make him complicit? The question gnawed at him like an open wound. The door opened, and Master Chief Williams entered, followed by 2 other senior instructors. Williams was a man who'd seen 3 decades of military service, and his face rarely showed emotion. But now, there was something in his expression that the recruits couldn't quite read. Disappointment, maybe, or anger, or perhaps something deeper. "Gentlemen," Williams began, and the words sounded like an accusation, "you are about to learn something that most people in this facility don't know. Commander Hartley has authorized me to share this information because he believes you need to understand the magnitude of what occurred today." He pulled up a chair and sat down, which was unusual. Master Chief Williams never sat during briefings. The informal posture somehow made the moment feel more serious, not less. "The woman you know as Irene Hill, your cleaning lady, is not who you think she is," Williams said slowly. "Her full name is Irene Hill Kovacic, and before she came to work at this facility, she served in the Croatian armed forces during the Yugoslav wars." The recruits exchanged confused glances. The Yugoslav wars had ended decades ago, but they'd studied them briefly in their geopolitical training. Brutal conflicts, marked by ethnic cleansing, war, crimes, and some of the worst atrocities Europe had seen since World War II. "Irene wasn't just a soldier," Williams continued. "She was a combat medic, attached to the Croatian army during the siege of Dubrovnik and later during operations in Bosnia. For 3 years she worked in field hospitals under constant bombardment, treating civilians and soldiers alike, often with limited supplies and no protection from incoming fire." Derek felt his stomach drop. The woman they'd dismissed as just a cleaning lady had seen real combat, had saved actual lives under conditions these recruits couldn't imagine. "In 1995, Williams went on, her field hospital was overrun by hostile forces. Irene managed to evacuate 12 wounded patients, including 3 children, by leading them through a minefield in the dead of night. She carried 2 of those children on her back. When they finally reached friendly lines, she collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition. She weighed less than 90 pounds. The room was completely silent. Even the sound of breathing seemed muted by the weight of Williams's words. After the war, Irene returned to Croatia, but the country was devastated. She lost her entire family, her parents, her 2 brothers, her fiancé, all killed in the conflict. She developed severe PTSD and couldn't practice medicine anymore. The trauma was too much. So she immigrated here, to the United States, looking for peace, for a quiet life where she could heal. Williams stood up, his hands clasped behind his back. She took a job as a cleaning lady because it asked nothing of her except simple, repetitive tasks. No life or death decisions, no blood, no screaming, just quiet work that let her mind rest. Commander Hartley knew her story because he served in Bosnia as part of NATO operations. He encountered her during a medical evacuation mission. She saved the lives of 3 of his teammates despite being wounded herself. The implications crashed over the recruits like a wave. They'd mocked a war hero. They'd bullied someone who'd shown more courage in a single night than most of them would demonstrate in their entire careers. And Tyler had pushed her down a flight of stairs like she was garbage. "Irene never told anyone here about her past," Williams said. "She didn't want recognition or special treatment. She just wanted to be left alone to do her work in peace. But you couldn't even give her that, could you?" One of the younger recruits, barely 19, had tears streaming down his face. "We didn't know," he whispered. "Would it have mattered if you did?" Williams shot back. "Should it have mattered?" Does someone need to be a war hero to deserve basic human dignity and respect? Or should we treat everyone with courtesy regardless of their position or background? No one answered. The question hung in the air, condemning them all. Commander Hartley sat in the hospital waiting room, his uniform collar unbuttoned, his command composure finally cracking in private. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the beeping of distant medical equipment created a backdrop to his turbulent thoughts. He'd been waiting for 3 hours while doctors examined Irene, and each minute felt like an eternity. His mind kept replaying the moment he'd seen her at the bottom of those stairs, broken and bleeding. The same woman who'd calmly treated his shrapnel wounds in a bombed-out Croatian field hospital while mortar rounds exploded outside. The same woman who'd refused evacuation until every wounded person in her care had been transported first. She'd survived a war that had killed thousands, had endured losses that would destroy most people, and she'd finally found a small measure of peace in America. And now, some arrogant recruit who didn't know the first thing about sacrifice had hurt her. The anger Hartley felt was matched only by his guilt. He'd known Irene was working at the facility. He'd helped arrange her employment. In fact, pulling strings to get her security clearance approved. But he'd respected her wishes to remain anonymous, to avoid any special attention. Now he wondered if that had been a mistake. If people had known who she was, would they have treated her differently? The question disgusted him, even as he thought it. People should treat everyone with respect, regardless of their history or status. But he knew the military, knew how hierarchies worked, how people judged worth based on rank and position rather than character. A doctor emerged from the examination area, pulling off his gloves. "Commander Hartley." Hartley stood immediately. "How is she?" "She's stable," the doctor said, consulting his tablet. "Concussion, 3 bruised ribs, multiple contusions, and a hairline fracture in her left wrist. She's lucky it wasn't worse. Falls down concrete stairs can be fatal." "Can I see her?" "She's awake and asking for you. Room 312. Hartley found Irene sitting up in the hospital bed, her left wrist in a temporary cast, a bandage wrapped around her head. Her face was pale, marked with bruises that would darken over the next few days. Despite everything, she managed a weak smile when he entered. "James," she said, her accent thicker when she was tired or stressed. "You didn't have to come." "Of course I came," Hartley said, pulling a chair close to her bed. "Irene, I'm so sorry. This never should have happened. You were under my protection, at my facility, and some punk recruit—" "It was accident," Irene interrupted gently. "Boys being boys, they didn't mean real harm." Hartley's jaw tightened. That's exactly the attitude that allows this behavior to continue. They assaulted you, Irene. What Tyler Bennett did wasn't an accident. It was the result of weeks of bullying and harassment that went unchecked. Irene looked down at her hands. They didn't know who I am. To them, I am just cleaning lady. That's precisely the point. Hartley's voice rose before he caught himself and lowered it again. You shouldn't need to be a war hero to be treated with dignity. The fact that you are makes their behavior even more reprehensible, but even if you were just an ordinary civilian contractor, what they did would still be completely unacceptable. Tears welled up in Irene's eyes, though she tried to blink them away. I liked being ordinary, James. I liked being invisible. In war, being noticed meant being target. Here, I thought being invisible meant being safe. Hartley's expression softened. He understood what she meant. After everything she'd survived, the simple act of cleaning floors had been her refuge, her way of controlling a small corner of a chaotic world, and now that refuge had been violated. I have to ask you something, Hartley said carefully. Do you want to press charges? What Tyler did constitutes assault. He could face civilian criminal charges, as well as military discipline. Irene was quiet for a long moment, staring at the hospital room wall. What good does punishment do? Will it undo what happened? Will it make him understand? It might make him think twice before he hurts someone else. Maybe, Irene said slowly. But maybe there is a better way. James, those boys, they are young. They are stupid, yes, but not evil. War taught me difference between stupid and evil. I have seen evil. These boys, they just don't understand yet what it means to serve, what it means to sacrifice. What are you suggesting? Irene looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering to seek revenge. Let me talk to them. Let me tell them my story. The conference room had been cleared of its usual furniture and set up with chairs in a semicircle. 20 recruits filed in, their faces showing various degrees of anxiety, shame, and confusion. They'd been ordered to attend this meeting but hadn't been told why or what to expect. Tyler Bennett sat in the back, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He'd spent the past 48 hours confined to quarters, his mind torturing him with images of Irene's body tumbling down those stairs. He'd been told that formal charges were being considered, that his military career was likely over before it had truly begun. But worse than any of that was the guilt that sat in his chest like a stone. Commander Hartley entered first, followed by Master Chief Williams. Then, moving slowly and using a cane for support, came Irene. Her face was still bruised, the bandage on her head a stark white against her dark hair. When the recruits saw her, several gasped audibly. She made her way to a chair at the front of the room, sitting down carefully to avoid aggravating her injured ribs. Commander Hartley remained standing beside her, his presence both protective and authoritative. "Gentlemen," Hartley began, "Ms. Hill has requested this meeting. Against my advice, and against the recommendations of her doctors, she insisted on speaking with you. You will listen with respect. You will not interrupt. And when she's finished, you will have the opportunity to respond if she chooses to allow it. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," echoed through the room. Irene looked at the assembled recruits, her gaze moving from face to face. When her eyes found Tyler, he wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and vanish. But he forced himself to meet her gaze, to not look away from what he'd done. "I want to tell you about war," Irene began, her voice quiet, but clear, clear. "Not the kind you study in books or see in movies. Real war. The kind where you hold 13-year-old boy while he dies because shrapnel has torn through his intestines and you have no morphine to give him. The kind where you make choices about who gets the last unit of blood because there isn't enough for everyone." The room was utterly silent. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed to fade as Irene spoke. "In 1992, I was 22 years old. I had just finished medical school in Zagreb. I wanted to be a pediatrician, to help children. Then war came to my country. In 2 months, everything changed. My city became battlefield, my hospital became morgue, my future became past." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I joined military as combat medic because doctors were needed. I thought I would work in safe hospital far from fighting, but there was no safe place. Shells fell everywhere, snipers shot at ambulances, soldiers on both sides forgot that medics are supposed to be protected." Derek, sitting in the third row, felt tears building but didn't bother to wipe them away. "For 3 years I worked in field hospitals under siege. We operated by candlelight when power was cut. We boiled instruments because we had no autoclaves. We rationed antibiotics, giving infection medicine only to those we thought would survive. I learned to make terrible choices, who would live, who would die." Irene's voice remained steady, but her hands gripped the arms of her chair tightly. "One night, hostile forces broke through our defensive lines," Irene continued, her eyes distant as she traveled back through time. "They were coming for our hospital. We had 43 patients, soldiers, civilians, children. Some were on ventilators. Some had just come out of surgery. Moving them could kill them. Leaving them would definitely kill them." She shifted in her chair, wincing slightly from the pain in her ribs. "I was most junior medic, but I was only one still standing. Others had been killed in shelling the day before. So I made a decision. We would evacuate through the forest, even though intelligence said the area was mined. Staying meant certain death, moving meant possible death. I chose possible." The recruit sat, frozen, barely breathing. Tyler's hands were shaking in his lap. "I carried 2 children on my back. A girl maybe 5 years old and her brother 7. Both had shrapnel wounds. Both were crying for their mother, who was already dead. We walked for 6 hours through the darkness, following a path I had memorized from old maps. Every step I thought might be my last. Every step I felt for the click of a landmine. Irene's voice wavered for the first time. 3 times. We heard explosions behind us. 3 times. I counted my patients and found someone missing. We lost 4 people that night to mines. I still hear their screams. In my sleep. She looked directly at Tyler. When we finally reached safe territory, I collapsed. I weighed 87 pounds. I had not eaten properly in 6 weeks. I had dysentery. I had lice. But 12 people lived because I carried them through minefield. 12 people who would have died if I'd been too weak, too scared, or too small to try. Tyler's face crumpled. Tears ran down his cheeks unchecked. After war ended, I came to America, Irene said, her voice softening. I came looking for peace, for silence, for days where no one dies, where no choices must be made, where I can just be. I took job cleaning because it asks nothing of my soul. I push mop, I empty trash, I go home. Simple, safe, quiet. She gestured around the room. I chose to be invisible because being seen, being known means people ask questions. They want to know about war. They want to hear stories like I just told you. But every story I tell reopens wounds that have not healed. Every memory brings back faces of people I couldn't save. The silence in the room was profound. Several recruits were openly crying now. So, when you pushed me down those stairs, Irene looked at Tyler again. It was not just physical pain you caused. It was a reminder that even here, even in quiet life, I am not safe. That people will hurt me for being in their way, for being less than them, for not mattering enough to protect. Tyler stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm sorry, he choked out. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand. Sit down, recruit, Commander Hartley said firmly. Tyler sat, burying his face in his hands. Irene watched him with an expression that might have been pity. You say you didn't know, but should you have needed to know? If I was just cleaning lady with no war history, would that make what you did acceptable? If I was just immigrant woman trying to make living, would I deserve less respect? The question hung in the air, unanswerable because everyone in the room knew the truth. This is what I want you to understand, Irene said, leaning forward despite the pain it caused. You are training to be warriors, yes, to be protectors, but who are you protecting if you cannot even protect person who cleans your toilets? What does your strength mean if you use it to bully those you see as weak? She gestured to her own small frame. I am 5 feet 2 inches tall. I weigh 115 pounds. By your standards, I am weak, but I have carried grown men through fire. I have performed surgery while building collapsed around me. I have made choices that saved lives and choices that ended them. My size did not determine my strength. My circumstances did not define my worth. Irene stood slowly, using the cane for support. You want to be SEALs? Then learn this lesson now. True strength is not in how much you can lift or how fast you can run. True strength is in how you treat people who cannot fight back, in how you protect those who need protection, in understanding that everyone you meet carries battles you know nothing about. The aftermath of Irene's testimony spread through the Naval Special Warfare Training Center like ripples across water. Within hours, every recruit, every instructor, every staff member had heard some version of what had happened. The cleaning lady who'd been pushed down the stairs wasn't just a civilian contractor. She was a war hero who'd saved more lives in a single night than most of these trainees would encounter in their entire careers. Tyler Bennett sat in his quarters, under guard, staring at the wall. He had been formally charged with assault and was awaiting a hearing that would determine his military future. But the legal consequences seemed almost trivial compared to the weight of what he'd done. He'd assaulted a woman who'd survived horrors he couldn't imagine, who'd come to America seeking peace, and who'd asked for nothing except to be left alone to do her work. His mind kept replaying moments from the past 6 months. Every time he'd made a comment about Irene's accent, every time he'd deliberately made extra mess for her to clean, every time he'd laughed at jokes made at her expense. At the time it had seemed harmless, just blowing off steam, just establishing the pecking order. Now each memory felt like a knife twisting in his gut. A knock at the door interrupted his spiral of self-recrimination. Master Chief Williams entered, his expression unreadable. "Bennett!" "You have a visitor," Williams said. "You're not obligated to see her, but she's requested to speak with you." Tyler's heart jumped. "Her? Ms. Hill is here. She wants to talk to you privately." Tyler stood up quickly, then hesitated. "Why would she want to talk to me? After what I did?" "That's between you and her," Williams said. "But I'll tell you this, recruit, that woman has more grace and dignity in her smallest finger than you've shown in your entire time here. If she's offering you a conversation, you'd be wise to take it." Irene was waiting in a small conference room, seated with her cane resting against the chair. She looked tired, the bruises on her face now a deep purple yellow, but her eyes were clear and steady. When Tyler entered, she gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit, please," she said. Tyler sat, unable to meet her eyes. "Ms. Hill, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry doesn't even begin to—" "Then don't say it," Irene interrupted gently. "Sorry is just word. I want to know if you understand why what you did was wrong." Tyler finally looked up at her. "Because I hurt you. Because I pushed you down the stairs and you could have died." "That is surface answer," Irene said. "Deeper. Why was it wrong?" Tyler struggled to articulate thoughts he'd been wrestling with for days. Because I saw you as less than human. I saw you as someone whose comfort, whose safety, whose dignity didn't matter because you were just the cleaning lady. I didn't see you as a person, with a history, with feelings, with—" His voice broke. "With all the things that make someone matter." Irene nodded slowly. "Yes, that is closer to truth. You dehumanized me, made me into thing instead of person. This is how all cruelty begins, by deciding that some people matter less than others." "I don't know how to make this right," Tyler said, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know how to undo what I did." "You cannot undo it," Irene said simply. "That is first lesson you must learn. Some actions have permanent consequences. I will heal physically, but this building where I felt safe, it is no longer safe. This job that gave me peace, it no longer gives peace. You have taken something from me that cannot be returned." The words hit Tyler like physical blows. He'd known he'd hurt her. But hearing her articulate exactly what he'd taken made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "However," Irene continued, "you can choose what person you become from this moment forward. You can let shame destroy you, or you can let it teach you. Which will you choose?" Tyler wiped his face with his sleeve. "I don't deserve a choice. I should be kicked out, court-martialed, whatever they want to do to me." "Perhaps you should," Irene agreed. "But I have asked Commander Hartley not to press maximum charges against you. I have asked that you be given chance to learn, to grow, to become a better person." Tyler's head snapped up. "Why? Why would you do that for me after what I did?" Irene was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the handle of her cane. "Because I have seen what happens when we demand only punishment, only revenge. I have lived in country torn apart by cycle of violence and retribution. Someone hurts you, you hurt them back. They hurt you again. It never ends. Someone must choose to break cycle." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I do not do this because you deserve mercy. I do it because I choose to be person who offers it anyway. But understand this, mercy is not weakness, mercy is not forgetting. Mercy is making conscious choice to respond to wrong with attempt at redemption rather than pure punishment." "I don't know if I can redeem this," Tyler whispered. "Then spend rest of your life trying," Irene said firmly. The investigation into the incident took 3 weeks. During that time, the entire atmosphere at the training center shifted. Recruits who'd once strutted through hallways with swagger now walked quietly, aware that they were being watched, judged, evaluated not just on their physical capabilities, but on their character. Commander Hartley had made it clear that the standards were changing. In a facility-wide briefing, he'd addressed the entire recruit class about what had happened and what it meant for their futures. "You're here because you want to be the best," Hartley had told them, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed auditorium. "You want to be Navy SEALs, the elite of the elite. But let me tell you something that your physical training and tactical exercises won't teach you. Being elite isn't just about what you can do, it's about who you are." He'd paced the stage, his hands clasped behind his back. Irene Hill survived a war that would break most of you before breakfast. She made life and death decisions under conditions you can't imagine. She carried wounded people through minefields. She operated on patients while shells exploded overhead. And she did all of that at a time when most of you were still in elementary school. The auditorium had been silent, except for the sound of his boots on the stage. "She came to America looking for peace, and she found a job here because I personally vouched for her. I told my superiors that she was someone who understood service, who understood sacrifice, who would be an asset to this facility, even in a support role. And what did you do? You mocked her, you dismissed her, and one of you assaulted her." Hartley had stopped pacing and faced the assembled recruits directly. "Every single one of you will face a choice at some point in your career. You'll have power over someone who can't fight back. Maybe it's a local national in a foreign country, maybe it's a civilian contractor, maybe it's a junior enlisted person in your unit. And in that moment, you'll have to decide, do you use that power to lift people up, or do you use it to push them down?" The message had resonated. In the days following that briefing, the treatment of support staff throughout the facility noticeably improved. Recruits held doors open, said please and thank you, treated every person they encountered with basic human decency. Some of it was performative, done out of fear of consequences. But some of it, Hartley hoped, was genuine learning. Derek had taken the lessons particularly to heart. He'd requested permission to visit Irene in the hospital before she was discharged, bringing flowers and a handwritten apology letter. She'd accepted both with grace, though she'd made it clear that the real test wouldn't be his words but his actions going forward. "You saw what was happening and you spoke up, even if not loudly enough," Irene had told him. "That is more than most people do. Build on that. Be the person who speaks up louder next time. Be the person who physically intervenes. Be the person who refuses to be bystander." Derek had taken those words seriously. He'd become something of an informal ethics officer among his cohort, calling out problematic behavior when he saw it, refusing to participate in the casual cruelty that often passed for camaraderie in military settings. It earned him some mockery from the harder cases in his class, but it also earned him respect from the instructors who mattered. Tyler's path was more complicated. The formal charges against him had been reduced at Irene's request, but he still faced administrative punishment, reduction in rank, loss of pay, and a formal letter of reprimand in his permanent record. More significantly, he'd been dropped from his training class and would have to restart the entire program from the beginning if he was allowed to continue at all. The decision about his future had been left to a review board composed of senior officers, including Commander Hartley. Tyler had been called before this board to explain why he should be allowed to remain in the military despite his actions. Standing at attention before the panel, Tyler had chosen honesty over self-preservation. "Sirs, I cannot give you a good reason why I should stay. What I did was inexcusable. I assaulted a woman who'd done nothing to me except exist in a space I felt entitled. There you do too. I bullied someone who'd shown more courage in one day than I've shown in my entire life. If you decide I don't belong here, I'll understand and accept that decision. But if you give me another chance," he'd continued, his voice steady despite his fear, "I promise you this. I will spend every day proving that Irene Hill's mercy wasn't misplaced. I will be the first person to stand up when I see someone being mistreated. I will remember that the weakest person in any room deserves the same respect as the strongest. And I will carry the lesson of what I did wrong with me for the rest of my life, so that I never forget the cost of cruelty." The board had deliberated for 2 hours before rendering their decision. 3 months after the incident, the training center held a ceremony that no one had expected. Commander Hartley had arranged for a formal recognition event, and the entire facility had been ordered to attend. Recruits, instructors, support staff, and senior officers filled the parade ground under a clear California sky. Irene stood near the back, uncomfortable with the attention. She'd returned to work 2 weeks after the incident, though not as a cleaning lady. Commander Hartley had offered her a position in the training division, helping to develop curricula around ethics, cultural sensitivity, and the human dimensions of warfare. She'd initially declined, preferring the simplicity of her previous role, but he'd been persistent. "Your experience matters," he'd told her. "These recruits need to learn from someone who's actually lived through what they're training for, not the tactical stuff. We have plenty of instructors for that, but the moral dimensions, the human cost, the reality of serving in conflict zones, you can teach that in a way that textbooks never will." Eventually, she'd agreed to try it on a part-time basis. The work was harder than cleaning, required her to engage with memories she'd tried to bury, but it also felt meaningful in a way that mopping floors never had. She was taking her pain and turning it into something that might prevent future harm. There was power in that. Now, standing on the parade ground, she watched as Commander Hartley took the podium. The ceremony began with standard military protocol, the national anthem, formal announcements, recognition of various achievements within the training program. Then, Hartley's tone shifted. "Today, we're here to acknowledge a debt," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled formation. "A debt that this facility, that the United States military, owes to someone who never asked for recognition, but who deserves it, nonetheless." He gestured for Irene to come forward. She hesitated, but Master Chief Williams appeared at her elbow, gently guiding her toward the podium. As she walked across the parade ground, her limp barely noticeable now, a strange thing happened. One recruit, then another, then entire formations began to applaud. The sound grew until it was thunderous, a wall of appreciation that made Irene's eyes sting with tears. At the podium, Commander Hartley produced a framed certificate and a small velvet box. "Irene Hill, on behalf of the United States Navy, and in recognition of your service during the Yugoslav wars, including your actions that directly saved the lives of American service members during NATO operations, I am authorized to present you with the Defense of Freedom Medal." He pinned the medal to her collar, a civilian award given to foreign nationals who've aided U.S. military operations at great personal risk. Irene touched it with trembling fingers, overwhelmed by the weight of recognition she'd never sought. "Additionally," Hartley continued, "in acknowledgement of your ongoing contribution to the ethical development of future naval special warfare operators, you are hereby appointed as senior ethics instructor with all the privileges and responsibilities that position entails." More applause, this time mixed with cheers. Irene looked out at the sea of faces, young recruits who'd learned a hard lesson about respect, instructors who'd been challenged to think more deeply about the values they were instilling, support staff who'd been reminded that their work mattered. Her eyes found Tyler, standing in the back formation with the newest training class. He'd been allowed to remain in the program, but he'd started over completely, losing 6 months of progress. When their eyes met, he stood straighter, his hand moving in a subtle gesture of respect. She nodded, slightly in acknowledgement. After the ceremony, as people dispersed, Derek approached Irene with several other recruits from his class. They'd all passed their initial training and would soon be moving on to more specialized courses. "Ms. Hill," Derek said formally, "we wanted to thank you for the lessons you've taught us, and for giving us a chance to be better than we were." "You don't thank me by saying words," Irene replied, a slight smile on her face. "You thank me by being the soldiers, the leaders, the people who remember what you learned here. When you have power over others, use it carefully. When you see any cruelty, stop it. When you have the choice between kindness and convenience, choose kindness." "We will," Derek promised, and she believed him. As the sun set over the training center, Irene walked slowly back to her new office. It was taller than the supply closet where she used to store her cleaning cart, but it had a window overlooking the obstacle course where recruits pushed themselves to their physical limits. She sat at her desk and pulled out a journal she'd started keeping since the incident. In it, she wrote, Today I was honored for old wounds. Tomorrow I will work to prevent new ones. This is not the peace I came to America seeking, but perhaps it is the purpose I was meant to find. The pain of the past does not disappear, but maybe it can be transformed into something that protects others. Maybe that is enough. She closed the journal and looked out at the recruits running the course, pushing themselves, testing their limits. They were so young, so sure of their strength, so certain of their invincibility. They had no idea what waited for them beyond these training grounds. The moral complexities, the impossible choices, the weight of responsibility that would shape them or break them. But now, at least they'd carry with them the memory of a small Croatian woman who'd survived worse than they could imagine and who'd chosen mercy over vengeance. Maybe that memory would make them pause before they acted with cruelty. Maybe it would make them think twice before they dismissed someone as unimportant. And maybe, just maybe, it would help them understand that true strength wasn't measured in physical power, but in moral courage. The courage to do right, even when it was difficult. To protect, even when it was inconvenient. To show mercy, even when it wasn't deserved. Irene smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Hope that her suffering might prevent someone else's. 6 months had passed since the ceremony, and the changes at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center had become permanent fixtures rather than temporary reactions. The ethics training program that Irene had developed was now mandatory for all incoming recruits, and her story had become part of the curriculum that every SEAL candidate studied. But the real changes were subtler, woven into the daily fabric of life at the facility. The way recruits interacted with support staff had fundamentally shifted. Cleaning crews, maintenance workers, administrative personnel, all were treated with a respect that went beyond mere politeness. It was genuine acknowledgement that every person contributing to the mission mattered, regardless of their position or rank. Irene had settled into her role as senior ethics instructor with unexpected comfort. The work was emotionally demanding. Each class required her to revisit memories she'd spent years trying to forget. But it was also deeply fulfilling. She watched young men arrive full of bravado and leave with something more valuable, wisdom tempered by understanding. Her teaching style was unconventional. Rather than lecturing from prepared materials, she told stories. She described the field hospital where she'd worked, the impossible decisions she'd faced, the patients she'd saved, and the ones she couldn't. She spoke about the aftermath of war, the nightmares, the survivor's guilt, the challenge of rebuilding a life when everything you knew had been destroyed. War is not adventure, she would tell each new class. It is not glory. It is not test of manhood. War is horror that sometimes becomes necessary, and those who fight must carry weight of what they do forever. Before you take life, before you risk life, you must understand this weight. You must be certain it is necessary. The recruits listened in a way they didn't listen to other instructors. There was something about Irene's quiet authority, her obvious scars, both visible and invisible, that commanded attention. She wasn't teaching theory. She was sharing lived experience that had cost her everything. Tyler had become one of her most attentive students. After being held back and restarting his training, he'd approached every lesson with humility that his earlier arrogance had lacked. He excelled in his coursework, not because he was trying to prove something, but because he was genuinely trying to become someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. During one of Irene's ethics seminars, Tyler had raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you forgive yourself when you've done something unforgivable?" The classroom had gone silent. Everyone knew Tyler's history, knew what he'd done and why he was asking. Irene had considered the question carefully before answering. "You don't forgive yourself," she'd said finally. "Not completely. What you did becomes part of who you are, a reminder to be better. The goal is not to forget or to absolve yourself. The goal is to ensure that the person you hurt, the mistake you made, leads to enough good that balance shifts. You cannot undo past, but you can shape future." Tyler had nodded, writing her words in his notebook with the intensity of someone memorizing a creed. Now, as Irene prepared for another day of classes, she reflected on how strange life was. She'd come to America seeking invisibility and found purpose instead. She'd taken a job cleaning toilets and ended up shaping the moral foundation of warriors. The path had been painful. The incident with Tyler had ripped open wounds she'd tried to seal, but perhaps those wounds needed to be reopened, needed to breathe, needed to be transformed into something useful. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Commander Hartley entered, carrying a folder thick with papers. "Irene, I have news," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "The Navy Department has been reviewing your curriculum. They want to expand it beyond just this facility. They're proposing that your ethics program be implemented at all special warfare training centers across the country." Irene's eyes widened. "All centers? James, that is very big." "It is," Hartley agreed. "And it means you'd need to train other instructors, develop standardized materials, possibly travel to different facilities to oversee implementation. I know it's more than you signed up for when you agreed to teach part-time, so I want you to know that you can say no. You've already given more than anyone could ask." Irene looked out her window at the obstacle course where recruits were training. She thought about all the young men who would go through these programs, all the situations they'd face, all the choices they'd make. If her story, her pain, her lessons could reach more of them, could prevent even a fraction of the suffering she'd witnessed, wasn't that worth the personal cost? "I will do it," she said quietly. "But I have condition." "Name it." "I want to include modules on recognizing signs of PTSD, on supporting teammates who struggle after deployment, on understanding that asking for help is not weakness. Too many soldiers suffer in silence after war. If I am teaching about ethics of combat, I must also teach about ethics of caring for those who have been in combat." Hartley smiled. "I think that can be arranged. In fact, I think it's brilliant. You're not just teaching them how to fight, you're teaching them how to survive what comes after." "Yeah," Irene said. "Because surviving the war is only first battle. Living with what you did, what you saw, what you lost, that is second battle, and sometimes it is harder than the first." 2 years after the incident on the stairs, the annual graduation ceremony for Navy SEAL candidates was held on a bright morning that seemed designed for celebration. Families filled the stands, flags snapped in the ocean breeze, and the sense of accomplishment was palpable among the graduating class. Irene sat in the section reserved for faculty, wearing a simple dress and the Defense of Freedom medal that she now wore to all formal events. Commander Hartley had insisted, "You earned it," he'd say, whenever she protested. "Let people see what real service looks like." The graduating class marched onto the field in perfect formation. Among them, in the third row, was Tyler Bennett. He'd made it through the entire program, had excelled in ways that surprised even his most optimistic instructors. But more than his physical achievements, Tyler had demonstrated the kind of moral courage that set him apart. He'd become the recruit who stood up for others, who questioned orders that seemed ethically questionable, who remembered that being a warrior meant being a protector. During the ceremony, several awards were announced. Academic excellence, physical achievement, leadership qualities, all were recognized and applauded. Then, Commander Hartley took the podium for a special announcement. "Each year, we recognize one graduating candidate who exemplifies not just the physical and tactical skills required of a Navy SEAL, but the ethical foundation that must underpin those skills. This year's recipient of the Moral Courage Award has a unique story." Hartley paused, letting the weight of his words settle. 2 years ago, this individual made a serious mistake that hurt someone under the protection of this facility. He could have been discharged, could have been prosecuted, could have had his military career ended before it truly began. But the person he hurt chose mercy over punishment, chose to see potential for growth rather than simply punishing failure. Irene knew what was coming. She'd been consulted about this award, had actually opposed it initially. He should not receive reward for learning basic human decency, she'd argued. But Hartley had convinced her otherwise. "We're not rewarding him for what he did wrong. We're acknowledging how he responded to his mistake, how he transformed shame into motivation to be better. That's worth recognizing. This recipient took that mercy and transformed himself completely, Hartley continued. He became the recruit who defended others, who questioned himself constantly, who understood that true strength includes the strength to admit when you're wrong. Petty Officer Tyler Bennett, front and center. Tyler marched forward, his face a mixture of pride and something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps, or the weight of remembering where he'd started. When he reached the podium, Hartley handed him the award, then did something unexpected. He gestured for Irene to join them. She walked to the podium slowly, aware of hundreds of eyes on her. When she reached Tyler, he stood at attention, not quite meeting her eyes. "Petty Officer Bennett," Irene said quietly, her voice amplified by the microphone. "2 years ago, you caused me great harm. You pushed me downstairs. Yes, but you also reminded me of every time in my life when people with power chose to abuse that power. You made me question whether I was safe anywhere, whether peace was possible for someone like me." The crowd was utterly silent. This wasn't the typical graduation speech. "But you also gave me gift, though you did not mean to," Irene continued. "You gave me reason to tell my story, to share my experiences, to turn my pain into tool for teaching. Because of what you did, I found purpose I didn't know I was looking for. Because of your mistake, hundreds of other recruits learned lessons they needed to learn." She finally looked directly at him. "I do not say this to thank you for pushing me downstairs. I say it to acknowledge that even from cruelty can come growth if we choose to pursue it. You chose growth. You chose to be better. That is why you deserve this recognition, not because you were good, but because you were bad and decided to become good anyway." Tyler's eyes were wet. "Ma'am, I will spend my entire career trying to be worthy of the chance you gave me." "I know you will," Irene said. "And when you are deployed, when you have power over others, when you must make difficult choices, remember this moment. Remember that how you treat the weakest person you encounter defines your character more than how you treat the strongest." The ceremony concluded with the traditional trident ceremony, where each new SEAL received the distinctive insignia that marked their achievement. As Tyler walked past Irene, after receiving his trident, he paused and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving. Thank you for becoming person worth the effort," she replied. After the ceremony, as families celebrated and photographs were taken, Irene stood apart, watching the joy and relief on the faces of the new graduates. She thought about her own journey, from war-torn Croatia to this sunny California base, from combat medic treating dying patients to instructor teaching living ones, from invisible cleaning lady to recognized educator shaping future warriors. The path had been painful. The incident with Tyler had torn open scars she'd hoped were healed, but perhaps healing wasn't about sealing wounds shut so tightly that nothing could penetrate. Perhaps healing was about transforming wounds into wisdom, pain into purpose, survival into service. Commander Hartley appeared beside her, following her gaze across the celebrating crowd. "You've changed this place, you know, fundamentally changed how we think about training these men." "They changed me too," Irene admitted. "I came here to hide from my past. Instead, I learned to use it." "Any regrets?" Irene considered the question. "I regret that it took being pushed downstairs to find this path, but I do not regret the path itself. Maybe that is enough." As the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the parade ground, Irene walked back toward her office. She had lesson plans to prepare, new instructors to train, and an entire program to expand across the country. The work would be difficult, would require her to repeatedly face memories she'd rather forget, but it was work that mattered. It was taking the worst moments of her life and ensuring they prevented suffering in someone else's. And maybe, in the end, that was the most anyone could hope for, to turn their pain into protection, their wounds into wisdom, their survival into service. The cleaning lady who'd been invisible had become impossible to ignore, and in that transformation, She'd taught an entire generation of warriors that true strength wasn't about dominating others. It was about lifting them up. Up next, you've got two more standout stories on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.